Michael is the Professor of Science Education at UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. He's a visiting professor at the Royal Veterinary College, Honorary Fellow at the British Science Association and of the College of Teachers, docent at the University of Helsinki, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and a priest in the Church of England. His research and consultancy interests are in science education, bioethics, and sex education. He's also the president of the International Society for Science and Religion and of the International Association for Science and Religion in Schools, a member of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and he writes on the interface of science, education, and theology, which makes him very well placed to speak to us today on learning to teach controversial topics in school science education. I'm really looking forward to it. So over to you, Michael.
I want to argue briefly for the value, the worth of teaching controversial issues in school science education. For a start, some issues are controversial simply because the science is not clear. So this is controversy understood as things not yet being settled, determined, known. And students often leave school science, I'm afraid, thinking that things are in science are completely clear-cut. So teaching them about genuine scientific controversies can be rather useful because it can be quite interesting and it can help to undermine that slightly simplistic notion about science. Indeed, for those of you who obviously either have or currently do work in science, any borderline science, by definition, is nearly always in that sense controversial because it's unclear, uncertain. So a very recent example would just be the use of face masks at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people got very upset about this in either one way or the other, by wearing them or not wearing them. But to scientists, initially, quite good hypotheses and so on as to what was likely to be the effect. But until you'd actually done some empirical work, you couldn't be very sure. Quite different reason, it can be motivating for students. Now, I don't want to overstate this. When I was in school, I was the sort of student who did not find controversies particularly motivating. I had this rather simplistic notion of science that I critiqued a minute or two ago. I just liked knowing, really enjoyed learning Newton's laws of motions or periodic table or things like that, where it was pretty clear cut. But other people are different. And one of the main things I learned as a teacher of school science is you've got to try and engage the diversity of learners you have. Different people are motivated by different things. Some are motivated by examples in science where the answer is not clear cut. And then a third reason, which overlaps with the second one in particular, is that quite often problems in society where we want to use science to help us deal with them are complicated. They're so-called wicked problems. So many ecological issues, loss of biodiversity, many health issues. What are the causes of obesity, for example, etc., etc. So teaching about controversial issues can help students think better about how they can use the science that they've learned to help understand societal issues. Okay, well, I better say a bit about what is a controversial issue. The definition that is by far the most common in the literature, not just in school science, but in teaching about controversial issues in general, is one by a philosopher of education called Dearden in 1981. And what Dearden came up with is what is often referred to as an epistemic criterion, a criterion to do with knowledge, quite straightforwardly, that an issue or a matter is controversial if contrary views can be held on it without those views being contrary to reason. Now, we can spend forever talking about what we mean by reason and so on, but basically, that was Dearden's view. It was quite a narrow view. Most people use the word controversial much more broadly. So if we think like an issue like, is it acceptable for students to express racist views in school? The answer is no, that's not controversial. It's not acceptable. Head teachers don't allow it. But in everyday language, you might say, oh, it's a bit controversial to say that sort of thing. And many textbooks that deal with how one deals with controversial issues in schools, what they mean by controversial issues is things where people have very strong opinions and about which they genuinely get upset, which tragically does not include whether there's an infinity of prime numbers or whether there's a limit to how many elements there are on the periodic table. It's controversial in the everyday sense of the term. Okay, and Dearden usually wins out in conversations about this among philosophers, but for most people really concerned with classrooms, a slightly broader perspective is quite useful. Okay, I just wanted to get, this is a colleague of mine, he's just retired, Ralph Levinson, but he came up with a rather useful list of the sorts of categories, he has 9 of them, of ways in which things might be controversial in science education. So the first one is very much at the pure science end. Look, where insufficient evidence is as yet available to settle a matter, but where such evidence could in principle be forthcoming at some point. That's like the COVID face masks. You know, how useful are COVID face masks in reducing the transmission of COVID-19? And that's now, roughly speaking, done and dusted. I don't have to talk through every single one of these. You'll see as I put them up that what we get is gradually not only things becoming more and more controversial, but the way in which they are controversial beginning to broaden. So the last one on this slide, I have a second slide I'll show, is where cherished goods is just because he was being supervised by a philosopher, and they're rather keen on technical meanings of cherish and goods, but where a range of things we value cannot simultaneously be realized. In other words, whether there's sort of clashes, and where there's a lack of a clear answer about the grounds on which priorities can be set and adjustments made. So to give a completely facetious example, you know, one isn't quite sure whether to enjoy an evening out, going to listen to some music, or having a meal with a friend or something like that. They're slightly incommensurate. It's quite difficult to use some sort of algorithm to decide. And then going through the other ones, they just, as I say, get broader and broader in the range of reasons why they're controversial, and they end up with where there is no agreement about whole frameworks of understanding relevant for judgment. So that's the point at which communication gets quite difficult. And I won't be talking about it now, but there's a large and rather valuable literature on what one should do in general in societies when people cannot communicate but are expressing opinions on the same issues. Sometimes you simply want to reduce the possibility of violence. Sometimes you simply want to leave dialogue going at however thin a level. And in a way, people who often work as negotiators use these sorts of approaches. You know, and there are various degrees to which one is transparent or not, and there are arguments for and against that. Okay, how might one teach, coming back now to the narrow question of school science education, how might one teach? Well, there are 3 traditional ways that tend to have been suggested in the literature. The first one, which is usually thought to be pretty uninteresting, is where the teacher advocates one particular point of view and argues for it. They might well acknowledge other points of view, but they're clear about which is the point of view they think is either right or closest to being right. There are 2 main problems with this, one of which is it doesn't tend to be incredibly interesting for some students, and perhaps more importantly in a way, it does rather trample on students' ability to start thinking critically, because of course the teacher is usually the most powerful person in a school classroom, both by virtue of their position and by what they know. So I'm just thinking of an example. Supposing you were having a classroom discussion. I'll give you, okay. I remember about 10 or 15 years ago, being honest, reading extremely technical arguments from world-class physicists explaining why solar power would never be any use in addressing the energy needs of countries. And because I'm quite reasonably good mathematically, not as good as some people, I had to go and reading these and could sort of see where the argument made huge jumps at some point. But they were clearly invalid. Anyway, as we know, they are invalid now because solar power's got fairly important. But the point is, a teacher normally would just trample over their students. So then you get the approach of what's called affirmative neutrality. So the idea here is that the teacher is neutral, there's a clue in the title, but they affirm the worth of each of a range of possibilities. So, for example, if you're talking about so-called energy generation, you might talk through, whether it's nuclear power, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's solar power, whether it's wind power, geothermal, or whatever, and give a range of possibilities and be quite positive about each of them, but also can critique them if there's accepted critiques. Again, it's not the most exciting way of being taught in the world, but it does introduce students to a range of possibilities, and some students quite like learning like that. And a good teacher can talk through the advantages and disadvantages of a whole range of ways of generating energy, and you can learn quite a lot, in a way. The other extreme is procedural neutrality, where the teacher again remains neutral, but they act as a sort of facilitator. So, you set up, carrying on with this example I've got, you maybe get students the previous lesson for their homework, you tell them to research a bit about the advantages and disadvantages of nuclear power, advantages and disadvantages of fossil fuels, etc. Prepare it in small groups, come back, 10 minutes to work together in groups of 3 or 4 at the beginning of the lesson, and then they all have 3 minutes to give their pitch. Well, that can work quite well as a way. It tends to be much more engaging for most learners. Taken to extreme, the teacher's only facilitator, so you get people giving advantages about one of these sources of energy that you, the teacher, think, crumbs, I'm not so sure about that. So most teachers don't go in for complete procedural neutrality. They have some sort of input from themselves as well. Just want to mention a fourth approach, which is less often in the literature, but is probably coming up quite quickly on the outside lane. This is by 3 people, 2 of whom I know very well, Justin Dillon and Marcus Grace, who argued 20 years ago that the very idea of what balance is when you're trying to teach controversial issues is itself a bit simplistic, because of course it depends on your perspective. If you're a CND supporter, your view of balance in an argument, class discussion, debate about power generation is unlikely to be the same as if you're somebody who's running Shell, for example. And therefore they argued for a bit more about developing in pupils a critical awareness of bias. And I'll pick up on this later when I broaden out to what we might be trying to do in science education overall. Okay, this is one of my ideas, and I'm quite keen on it, though I can't say it's exactly dominated the literature since I published it. It's the idea that what we call controversial issues in school science, topics like evolution and climate change, which I'll come on to, might often be better thought of as sensitive issues. And the reason being, most human beings, and particularly most teachers, are rather good at dealing with when people, students in the case of teachers, get upset about things. One's instinctive reaction is to sort of soften one's voice. In my case, you tend to make yourself a bit smaller, but that's just me. Some of you, but you just behave differently. Your tone of voice changes. You slow down. You listen you look extremely carefully. You're very, very careful with your language. I'm an evolutionary biologist by background. This is how we evolved as humans, okay? Sea anemones don't go in for this sort of thing. We do. We're good at noticing what other humans do. Sea anemones are not like that at all. So good teaching might often get a long way if you were just very respectful of students and imagine students come from different backgrounds, and that what to you as let's say, a teacher of biology and evolution might seem, really exciting, straightforward, to other people might be, because of home circumstances or religious affiliation or whatever, might be very, very difficult for them. And we're quite good at teaching when people find things difficult. There's a literature about how to teach about death, for example, and so on. I thought I'd say a bit now about teaching about evolution. I'm going to say less about this, actually, than the other two examples. I'm very comfortable us getting onto it in the questions. This is simply because it's dominated so much of my life for about the last 15 years, because, as I mentioned briefly, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and as Steph nicely said, I'm an ordained minister and in the Church of England. And when creationism first started becoming a real issue in schools in England, which is only really about 20 years ago, there weren't that many people, Dennis, one of them sitting here alongside me, but there weren't that many of us who really, were reasonably up on the issues. So people like Dennis get grabbed for infinite, that's a lay use of the term, infinite number of talks about these and helping organisations, and I ended up doing some of the same. But one of the things I've definitely learned the last 5 years, which is quite nice, is that often the survey instruments used to try and find out people's views about science, religion in general, or evolution and religion in particular, they're quite crude. This is even if they're quite well psychometrically validated, but they don't get at the complexity. And we're now getting more and more good studies at looking, well, what actually happens when people are teaching these areas? So for some of you who just read while other people are talking, you'll see this is an example simply where they're looking at, this is a study in California and Hawaii, where they're looking at the teaching of evolution from teachers who themselves have quite a strong Christian faith. And the point is that although, and you find this in most questionnaire correlations, on average, the stronger the teacher's religious beliefs, the more negative they are about evolution. What you found in practice in terms of how they taught was them being very, dare I say, sensitive to their students, very considerate, model respectful disagreement, supportive of the teaching of evolution in Christian schools, because it engaged students in critical thinking. And there's one more other quite long spiel. This is in Israel, and it's a very similar sort of finding in a different setting, where obviously Judaism is the numerically most important religion, but there are quite a lot of Arabs, so Islam is important in Israel, and Christianity is important to a smaller extent, and some other religions too. But again, they're using the word sensitivity, done with a lot of sensitivity, not with power. This is a controversial issue. Gradually, teacher training courses were opened. No one forced teachers to do it, not done in a forceful way, didn't get any complaints. And there's some good, more recent work that, again, Dennis and I know about in Israel, about trying to move forward in a very pluralist country at richer ways of teaching about science and religion in general and evolution in particular. Okay, I thought I'd spend a bit more time on, first of all, climate change and then vaccines, just because they're not probably done quite as often as evolution. So this shows, of course, President Joe Biden and El-Sisi at the start of COP27, which was, as most of you will know, pretty unsuccessful attempt at moving climate change issues forward. But one way of teaching about climate change in schools is to concentrate very much on the, as it were, pure science. So you'll be familiar with these sort of graphs. They're now pretty uncontentious. Some people still argue that these things are invalid, that, for example, not usually on conspiracy theory grounds, more on grounds like the buoys that measure temperature around the oceans are badly placed, and it's not a good enough either systematic or random distribution, or various other objections. But for most of us, although I can remember when I was at school, new scientists genuinely running articles about, is it going to be global warming or global cooling? They thought it was probably going to be global warming, but there were perfectly decent people arguing 45, 50 years ago for global cooling on the grounds that the build-up in the number of aerosols, the amount of aerosols in the air, which does, roughly speaking, block out the sun's rays and causes cooling, might be a more important factor, pollution, than might be build-up of carbon dioxide. And they didn't then know all the positive feedback loops that we now know. So there's a lot of real science there one can talk about, and When teaching, depending on the age range, you can talk about not just carbon dioxide, but water vapor, one of the contributing gases to global warming, methane, 80 times as powerful per molecule, but half-life of methane, less than an order of magnitude of that of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So depending on how good the students are, you can get into some really good science teaching. You will be familiar, I suspect, with this sort of graph as well. Many students in schools are quite surprised. They sort of assume global warming is equally distributed around the globe. It's not, of course, roughly speaking, in the Northern Hemisphere in particular. The further north you go, the worse it is. I was chatting to somebody about going to Iceland quite a lot. I've only been going over 20 years, but even in those 20 years, at an anecdotal level, you notice the difference in glacial retreats, and it's just not as terrifyingly cold as it was. You're much less likely to get frostbite now, for example. This is more, reasonably objective data, sea height changes over time and so on. You can then begin to broaden when you want to teach about climate change. So this is still objective data, but it's social science data. It's not natural science data. It's in the US. It's one of these slightly, I find them always a bit demanding as a graph because it's only got one horizontal axis, which is the year from 1980 to 2021. But on the left-hand vertical axis, it's got the number of disaster events that caused more than $1 billion worth of damage. And that's the black line, which you can just about see. It doesn't evenly go up. It's very stochastic. But roughly speaking, every now and again, you can see over time, there seem to be more of these events. By the way, $1 billion is inflation adjusted. So it's not just something to do with cost of living. And then on the right-hand vertical axis, you've got the total cost that year in billions of dollars, where it is clearer. It's going up, and any sort of correlation coefficient would show a positive correlation between that axis and time on the horizontal axis. You can get into other effects of climate change. This is actually pretty much pure science, thinking about it. I've got those two slides in the wrong order. It's a horrible slide in a way. I'll move on quite quickly. It's not a staged photo, it's genuine. Some of you will know perfectly well that polar bears, roughly speaking, rely on decent amounts of ice in the spring and summer because they find that's what the seals haul out, and polar bears are good then at hunting on those sort of flows by using surprise, basically. They can't catch seals in open water, is the short version. It's getting a lot warmer, great deal less ice in the spring and summer. Polar bears are not endangered, but their numbers are going down, they're starving, they're becoming more of a nuisance to people because, like any predator, they will try and find food elsewhere. I just want to put this one in because, as some of you know, the giant panda is a success story of Chinese captive breeding. It's difficult to breed over in most other parts of the world, but the Chinese got on top of it totally. But it'll be very interesting, I hope. And they've reintroduced them to the wild. It's now gone down the IUCN rankings for how endangered it is. But bamboo, you're living off one, roughly speaking, it's not one species, but one group of closely related species, pretty temperature sensitive, quite apart from all the habitat destruction. We will find more and more iconic species reducing in numbers or even going extinct because of climate change. Then definitely moving away from the natural and social sciences. If you want, you can get students to think about, well, how should we respond to climate change? Which I think definitely makes it a controversial issue. Because the thing now about evolution and climate change is going back to my Dearden epistemic definition of controversy, where alternative views can be held validly without controverting reason. It's getting harder and harder with climate change to argue against the fact that human-caused climate change is happening. I mentioned very briefly those discussions about global warming, and it's the same about sea level rises and acidification of the oceans and a number of extreme weather events, and increasingly we know the mechanisms for all of those. You may remember 20 years ago, a lot of academics thought that climate change had nothing to do with hurricanes. Genuinely thought it hadn't. Now you teach in school geography lessons about the reason why we're getting more hurricanes, because it's such a simple explanation just to do with temperature differentials that it's quite a good way of students understanding a bit of physical geography. So those bits aren't controversial. What is much more controversial is what we should be doing about climate change, fairly obviously. So depending on the sort of science education you want in schools, you can back away and not get onto that at all, or you can get students to suggest what they think they should be done, or you can tell them what other people do. So here we have, as you can see, a photo of Greta Thunberg, who sadly couldn't be with us here today, who is rather well known for what she has managed to achieve already, which is considerable and impressive. And of course, it's not just Greta Thunberg, lots of people campaigning against climate change. And on a different note, because it's not just about campaigning, this is a photo I quite like. I'm glad to say all the photos can be in the they're in the public domain. They're allowed to be, published subsequently and so on. This is a group of Filipino students who've just had a translate-a-thon. In other words, they've spent, 2 days, one night, translating loads of IUCN and other documents usually published in English or American into the local language, into Filipino, sort of thing. So doing something to allow more people locally to read about international agreements. Okay, before I say finally on the bit about vaccine education, this is where I just want to mention 3 different visions for school science education. The one that many of us of a certain age will be more familiar with from our schooling, though I think it'll have been an implicit vision. I don't think anybody will have stood up to you and say, today we're doing vision 1, children, okay? It's basically, it starts from science. It is about presenting what science is. It's trying to engage learners with the excitement of how knowledge is built up in science. It has a sort of hope that they might go on and choose science when it's no longer compulsory in school, and they might then perhaps go on to have a degree in science, or if they don't have a degree, to use science in their work career in some way. So that's vision 1. Vision 2, which has been around for perhaps 30-ish years, is sometimes called science for all, because there's a realization that vision 1 only applied to a certain proportion of students. You can't have everybody doing science degrees or having careers in science. We want one poet or something like that. So vision 2 is about science for all people, and therefore it started thinking about science for citizenship, science to enable us better to make decisions in our personal lives, and so on. And the curriculum in England at one point in school science broadened considerably to have this as the sort of core approach. Very interesting. I don't know if many of you remember this. It was about 20 years ago. It then got torn apart largely because of the Daily Mail campaign against it, because it was seen as dumbing down. And when you set GCSE examinations, so usually for 16-year-olds, you have, as some of you may know in science and in maths, you have different papers for different students depending on what teachers think would be their likely outcome. So you have some, what to most of us would look like extremely simple questions. And some of these simple questions about science for all, they do look like the sort of thing that most of you would discuss with an 8 or 9-year-old rather than with a 16-year-old. And there was a campaign against them. And of course, at the time with Conservative government in power, it was very easy to be, oh, it's not fair of me. I think, oh dear, I forgot which year it was now. I think it was between 97 and 2010 when the Labour government was in power. But the important point was for science education, it basically led to almost the disappearance of this approach. We've gone back to Vision 1. And I just wanted to mention Vision 3, which is a more radical vision, a humanized science education, which would include critical scientific literacy, where you encourage students to be more critical of standard scientific accounts. And you might get them to think about, well, what is most scientific research done on? You know, is it good to have research done in the military, in pharmaceutical companies? Can I immediately say, I'm not naively saying I think one is good, one is bad, or anything stupid like that, but you might get students to start thinking about the uses to which science is put. You remember COP26, the one in Glasgow, which we, the UK, hosted, very interestingly. So soon, about the same time, the Department for Education published quite a radical agenda on climate change, which is now slowly dissipating, which very much was a Vision 3, and talked about students being taught about how to take action in science. We'd never had anything like that. It's still officially there, but we haven't had any revisions to the national curriculum. It'll be interesting to see if it disappears. Okay, last one I'm going to talk about, then I'll stop. Vaccine education. This is not the main thing you're going to learn today, vaccine hesitancy, but I want to emphasize it's not just COVID. Vaccine hesitancy is becoming more of an issue for some 20 years or more. But in schools, which is my focus more than society and the media, in schools, immunization, which is basically a synonym for vaccination to all intents and purposes at school level, is just presented as an unqualified good. It is not presented as a controversial issue. And therefore, those who reject immunization or are simply hesitant about it are seen rather as those who reject the theory of evolution or anthropogenic climate change. They're often seen as being ignorant of the science. Indeed, in terms of vaccines, it's worse than that because they're often seen as being very selfish. The idea is, you know, you're not going to get your child vaccinated against, you know, measles, mumps, rubella. You're just relying on the 95% of the rest of us who are getting our child, sort of thing. Early history of protection against smallpox. It's the most wonderful topic to teach in schools, vaccines. I admit this is not quite as rock solid, sadly, now as I thought, because it's quite difficult to work out historically which diseases really were playing a part. So smallpox may have played a part, probably played a part, in the decline of the Roman Empire. So the plague of Antonine is thought to have killed 7 million people, which, you know, as a proportion of the known world is vastly more than have died from COVID. It definitely, getting onto solid ground now, because we've got good enough paintings and accounts of the symptoms, was introduced into the New World by the Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors and was instrumental in the fall of the Aztec and Inca civilizations, as you may know. What I only learned a few years ago was over 90% of people in some South American countries died in 2 generations. And the effects on agriculture were so extreme, this is in the 16th, early 17th century, that we genuinely, that's when we went through a period of global cooling, because there was less agriculture happening in South America. And what that means is a lot more natural growth of vegetation, carbon dioxide taken from the atmosphere, global carbon dioxide levels almost certainly fell, but it got cooler. Some of you may know the phrase, the Little Ice Age, all those lovely paintings by those continental masters, Bruegel and others, The Hunter in the Snow, frost fairs in the 17th, even the 18th century in Europe, on the Thames, etc. Almost certainly all the direct result of smallpox becoming more frequent around the world, having been introduced into South America. By the time we get to where there's reasonably solid data, we don't know when smallpox started, probably about 5,000 years ago, which is when a lot of these diseases that moved from animals to humans started. It could have been as long as 10,000 ago, but it almost certainly wasn't before that. You need quite good concentrations of people, which you only get with urbanization. But in the 18th century in Europe, 400,000 people died every year from it. And this is the last bit I didn't know until a few years ago. A third of those who survived went blind. Mortality rate typically 20-ish%, but if you had poor nutrition or you were very young, could get up to 80%. In the worst cases, well over 90%. The history of protection against smallpox is fascinating because all you get in school books in most countries is Edward Jenner. Now, Edward Jenner is a good thing, you know, in 1066 and all that, he's a good king, okay? But there was an enormous backstory to it. So as early as 430 before the Common Era, they were getting survivors of smallpox to nurse those who had smallpox. In other words, there was knowledge that you didn't tend to get it more than once. If you survived, you were then pretty immune. And I don't know how many of you have heard, I can only ask people in the room, I'm afraid, but just out of interest, if you know or heard much about the story of variolation or inoculation, can you just wave a hand? That's useful for me, because frankly, that's only about a quarter to a fifth of us. I won't tell you the full version, just for people who are interested in, you know, science education not being quite so sort of white. It was practiced in Africa, India, and China, and some other countries long before it was introduced into Europe. The story I often enjoy telling is of a particular rather wonderful, amazing woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, whose husband was one of the two ambassadors we had at the time. This is 1718 in Turkey, and she had already caught smallpox and survived and didn't go blind, but in the rather sort of sexist language of the time was, you know, described as having a ruined visage. So like most people, they end up very pock-marked, smallpox. And she got the surgeon to inoculate her 5-year-old child. Now, please don't try this at home, okay? But what you do is you find somebody who's had smallpox, you collect from some of the dried-ish up spots some of the material. You then wait. They've known for over a millennium, you waited a long time. So it's something about diminution of the power of the infectious agent. And then you want to introduce it in some way into the person you're trying to protect, the everyday use of the word inoculate. You're trying to inoculate them. So the Chinese did it up the nostril. I can never remember, but it was either the right nostril or the left nostril for girls and the opposite one for boys. Different people did it in different ways. The most common was just to scratch it on the arm or something. And the short version is total success. And she then had her daughter done as well. This is a picture of her without showing her pox marks, and her son. And when she came back to England, it was a great success. And rather a lot of people had their children inoculated, given how frequent smallpox was. However, the fatality rate from inoculation or variolation was about 2%. So it's still pretty high, less than 20%, but then you're definitely giving it to somebody, not just sitting around hoping that, you know, you won't have a car accident when you go at 40 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour limit. Human nature is much better at hoping. There were both with variolation and subsequent to Jenner. I won't go through the whole Jenner story, which I think you probably will know, but there were then trials. Well, who do you trial it on? Because smallpox is really worrying. Well, prisoners and orphans, pretty obvious, isn't it? You know, they didn't quite have medical ethics then as we probably try and do now, but it worked, I mean, to be fair. I've said the efficacy for variolation. Jenner, as I said, the story. If you go to the Jenner Museum, you can still see the horn from Blossom the cow who gave cowpox to the milkmaid from whom Jenner took the material, the pustule, from the pustule, which was basically because of cowpox, which he then used to develop the vaccination. Early objections to vaccination, because there were a lot of objections when it came in. It was pretty soon made compulsory. Okay, none of this rubbish of freedom of choice. So people first of all said, well, they didn't work. Then they say they weren't safe. And by the way, they didn't always work, because it's not trivial to do. We got better and better. They're certainly not always safe. They're a lot safer than variolation, which in turn was safer than getting smallpox. I forget the exact statistics, but I think it's 1 in 300,000 people tended to die on average from a smallpox vaccination before it was discontinued because of smallpox going extinct. And I don't know if any of you remember, because most of you are too young, but it wasn't uncommon for people to feel sufficiently grotty, having had it, to have a couple of days in bed. You know, as a parent, you put up with that fairly obviously, given the alternatives. But to be honest, it makes, to declare my allegiance, it makes, COVID vaccination just look absolutely unbelievable compared to what it was like. And the third big objection was their compulsory introduction violated personal liberties. And there were marches. There were 100,000 people demonstrating in Ipswich. Didn't know you could ever get 100,000 people in Ipswich for anything. And there's some wonderful cartoons. This is a very famous one, Gilray. You might like me to point out to you in the picture in the background, which is, of course, of the golden calf. Gilray would expect people at the time to be able to make the connection between worshipping a calf and worshipping cowpox, as it were. Current objections to vaccination: they don't work, they aren't safe, their compulsory introduction violates personal liberties. We've got more now. They're made in ways that are considered morally unacceptable. You may know this, a lot of vaccines in general, when they were the golden age of vaccination in many ways, or vaccine development, was the sort of 50s, 60s. Some of them used cell lines which derived from aborted fetuses. And I don't mean fetuses that had miscarried. I meant where there was an elective abortion. So not surprisingly, some people, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, is not keen on this. And to this day, quite a lot of very widely used vaccines have that as their origins. Nowadays, you get far more conspiracy theories than you got in the past. Scientists and the companies can't be trusted, government can't be trusted, international conspiracy, Bill Gates using them to somehow do something to all of us, and they're unnatural, which is always a good argument of last resort when you don't like something in biology, etc. So demonstrations can cause injury and death, not safe, violate bodily autonomy. And I just want to briefly mention as I'm finishing, you can relate back what you want to do if you teach about vaccines to Vision 1, which is very much about teaching the physiology, the pure science. Vision 2, which might be more about, is it a good idea to vaccinate oneself, one's children or not? Science for all. Vision 3 would be interested in things like, well, who benefits from vaccinations? Are there some sectors in society that don't benefit as much? What's the worldwide availability of vaccination? More of a critical look. Last slide for me. I just want to step back. I always love this. Some people know this. This is von Helmont in the 1640s. Two big theories at the time about where the stuff comes from that ends up in plants. So theory one, which is the common sense theory, well, it comes from the soil, doesn't it? I mean, honestly, get on to the next question. Masses of soil, plants grow. Theory two, from the air. I mean, for crying out loud. Anyway, so von Helmont, decent scientist, does a lovely experiment, weighs very carefully. Dry dirt is a fairly horrible way of describing it, but anyway, soil. Baby willow tree, 5 years later, only 4 ounces loss of mass from the soil. And the willow tree's gone up 164 pounds. The point is, give me 40 minutes and a group of teenagers who don't know and haven't got much interest in whether plants grow because of what's in the soil or the atmosphere. Through those sorts of historical examples, a few starch tests, a couple of experiments, you can get 90% of them to happily accept. You don't, of course, with a class where half of them don't accept evolution or anthropogenic climate change or vaccination. You don't, in a single lesson, get 90% of them to accept it by the end. And that shouldn't be one's aim. My own view is it takes a lot longer for people to change their mind when they have a lot about themselves invested in it. And what good science education can do is actually very close, quite often, to sticking to the good science and then enabling people to think for themselves and eventually make up their own minds. Great, I'll stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, that was absolutely fascinating. We've now got a chance to dive into some questions.
Super, thanks for your talk, Michael. I have a background in science teaching, and my experience is very much that science departments feel that they're right, that children are not taught to kind of question science, they're just taught to know the right answer. And there's quite a strong anti-Christian agenda. Have you noticed the same thing, and how do you respond to that?
So I've certainly noticed the first two. So I'm afraid science teachers can be, putting it nicely, quite self-confident, drifting towards arrogance. Interestingly enough, I haven't noticed the last so much, the sort of anti-Christian or anti-religious agenda more often. I could finesse it. Often a strong belief by many individuals that they are secularists, they are humanists, but the survey evidence, having earlier critiqued surveys, the survey evidence on science teachers in England shows that actually they're pretty good at separating their own position from what they think they should do as a teacher. On average, you may have particular experiences that are different. So I'm quite encouraged. And certainly in initial teacher education, I don't know if you've ever been involved in that or not, you know, we get large groups of students who vary from the sort of people who make Richard Dawkins look like a bit of a liberal, right through to the ones who are sort of, you know, Attila the Hun sort of enthusiasm for certain positions. And yet, in terms of their teaching, they're quite good at trying. So it may just be me being optimistic.
I'm trying to work out how to do this as a clear question, and it's not quite getting there. But right at the end, you were the photosynthesis example, and then you would need a lot longer to even attempt to move someone from a position. I was just wondering if you were making a link to that with your terminology of sensitive rather than controversial. Because I think when we have a starting point of this is controversy, I think the response to that is often defensiveness. Whereas I think when we have a starting point of sensitivity, the response to that is gentler, less tribal. But I was wondering, am I adding that to what, see, a terrible question, am I adding that to what you're saying, or is that kind of what you're saying?
No, you are adding it in a way I rather like, in that I hadn't quite linked those two together, and I find it quite convincing. One bit of data I'll mention, which I hope is seen to be relevant, which is a study I always rather like, which is a study that looked at a fairly evangelical US Christian college in the South, where you could choose to study evolution. You could choose to study biology. You could choose to study biology. But because it's one of these quite small colleges or universities, the students ended up knowing quite a lot about their professors, so they soon knew which of them accepted the theory of evolution and which didn't. But what you found was that when they knew that some professors accepted the theory of evolution, but they worshipped regularly at church, and they treated students with respect, and they seemed rather nice people, it was very difficult for these students, initially 19 years old, to keep up week after week the sort of belief that some of them had started with, that these were agents of Satan trying to drag them down to eternal destruction, which is what sometimes they've been taught by their churches or by their families about people who accepted evolution, because these just seemed rather nice middle-aged academics. And the quite good quality data on people's views about evolution didn't show the students suddenly becoming enthusiastic evolutionists, but showed them becoming much more comfortable with some of the core theories. So, for example, they were much likely to shift, well, I hope this is right, I can't remember the questions very well, but I think they were much more likely to shift away from a young Earth creationist perspective to one to do with much longer periods of time, which is a very classic way for people who are not comfortable with evolution, but initially thinking, well, I can sort of see maybe I was reading it a little bit more literally than scripture was intended. Thank you. Do you want an online one? It's up to you, Steph, or there's lots of people in the room. Yep.
Thanks for your talk, that's great. Picking up on your comment regarding vaccines and your government being untrustworthy or companies being untrustworthy and so on and so forth. Sitting in Cambridge, we can sort of look at that point of view and we can say, okay, this is a conspiracy theory. So the work that I'm doing looks at science and religion in other globalized contexts. And there are many countries in the world where not trusting your government is just ground zero of rationality.
Good. Good.
Do you have, and for example, so I've worked in a country where talking about scientific controversy, I've had to not talk about certain issues, not because of the problem with the science, but because broaching something controversial in the classroom might allow people to accept that maybe the government wasn't perfect in everything it said. So you just said, we're not going to discuss anything that rocks the boat because... Yes. So from that point of view, do you have any thoughts on things that look like conspiracy theories or controversies in one place, but are really, really reasonable in other contexts?
Well, absolutely agreed. And we know quite a lot about the fact that the less people trust their governments for those valid reasons, the more sceptical they are about lots of things. Rather sadly, for a whole range of reasons, not surprisingly, those countries have much lower levels of human happiness on average. People are even less likely to trust neighbours, things like that. It's like a whole sort of parcel. Whenever you get corruption in an organisation or a society or a country, it's very difficult to move away from it, and it's deeply, deeply corrosive. That's only a sort of gloss on what you said, but I really like your fundamental point that what seems like a conspiracy theory in one country may be rock solid reality in another country. And I'm not so naive to think that the country I live in never has a government that tries, sorry, putting more positives very badly. Sometimes, even in countries that are still scored quite highly on international measures of democracy, you have governments that try and cover things up, that take advantage of messy situations, that individuals look for personal gain, and those are all the beginnings of that. You probably know the UK slipped down international leagues of democracy and corruption the last decade or so, surprisingly fast. We're still way above most countries, but yeah, thank you.
Just take a question from online quickly. We've got one here that says, do you find that you have to engage both intellectually and emotionally with your students?
Yeah, and I enjoy that as a teacher. I think that's rather fun, because if it's only the intellectual, I think eventually I'd only probably enjoy teaching very good doctoral students or something like that. But as I mentioned very briefly in passing earlier on, one of the things I learned very early on was how different students are, which is a rather obvious point. But take a topic like genetics. So when I was taught genetics, which I was well taught at school, basically we were taught the sort of maths of it. You know, those days it was mainly Mendelian and dihybrid, monohybrid crosses, and we were taught what you could see under a good quality binocular microscope about the behavior of chromosomes. And there was then just an assumption you could sort of put the two together, which if you're bright and you've been well taught, you can do. Of course, now I know there are loads of people who've got no interest or don't understand the maths of 9:3 to, 3:1 ratios, and genuinely are not clear whether chromosomes are bigger or smaller than the cell. You know, you learn when you teach in schools a lot, you learn how you have to do everything very, very clearly. And also some people love the history, a few students, so they love being told about Darwin and Mendel and stories like that. Other people just want, what's the relevance, what's the application? So you teach about milk yields, and even the ones who are not very sure which end of a cow is which eventually get interested in that, particularly when they realize the mistakes that were made with overbreeding just for milk yields, which, as some of you will know, is why you end up with cows that have very low fertility levels or in very poor animal welfare conditions, things like that. So huge diversity, both the individual, the human, the personal, the emotional, and the intellectual.
Thank you. So many hands.
Thank you. Years ago, I heard you make a very helpful distinction about teaching X and teaching about X.
Oh, thank you.
Or the teaching of X and the teaching about X. I found that very, very helpful at the time. And so thank you. But I'm intrigued in what you've said here and maybe what's coming out here about the notion of subjects in which people are personally implicated. And I'm just reflecting that sort of distinction that I found very helpful. I'd love to hear you sort of reflect a little on subjects where it's just very hard to almost have that disengaged stance that this is something I can look at a distance. Do you hear the gesture of it's an invitation to think about?
So I've only got part way towards even understanding the question, but first of all, those who are not clear, this is not a thing about algebra, it's about the difference between teaching evolution in the sense of promoting, advocating, and teaching about evolution. It was a particular instance that I've done it. So I've always found that quite useful because I don't see my job, although as I said, I'm an evolutionary biologist, PhD postdoc, rather passionate about it, but I don't see my job to persuade people to accept the validity or truth of evolution. But I do think every student in an ordinary school in England ought to be taught about the theory of evolution. You ought to know it. You genuinely ought to know it, just as you ought to know about, for example, Hinduism, even if you're not a Hindu and you don't come from a Hindu family, because it's one of the world's great religions, and it's good, and that's what school's about, teaching us stuff. So that's it. Now, I do like your question, which is something about the connection between that point and when it's difficult to distinguish between teaching X and teaching about X because of the personal significance. Can you give us an example of when something might be so personally significant that it's difficult to distinguish?
Gender.
Oh, gender.
Race.
Yes. I told Julie or something.
Take your pick.
So we get on to
sexuality.
Sex education.
These aren't abstract.
Every time I have a conversation nowadays with somebody, I end up getting harangued.
I could think of about 17 off the top of my head, but
thank you. A bit of me that likes teasing. You mean 17 genders, or you mean 17 different topics? So, I think that's a very good point. And that's where the sensitivity might come up, because the bereavement, you don't teach about a topic like death, say in a subject like RE, which you teach quite often, and biology we do a bit. If you know there's a child in one's classroom who's got a very close relative who's either just died or is dying, I'd have to think more carefully to give a really good answer. The usual standard answers given are don't expect those students for whom something is deeply personally significant to contribute to a class discussion if they don't want to, but ensure you're alert to the possibility they might, because they might have their own lived experience. That's quite helpful. You can tell students in advance sometimes, even quite openly, let's say it's a biology lesson, right, next time we're going to have a look about sex and gender. You probably know the standard story of X, 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 Y. I want to look at whether that's all there is to it or whether there's something more. That's sort of incredibly general. I would find it difficult to imagine any parent who's going to demand I'd be barred from teaching in the school by saying that at the end of a lesson. Okay? Whereas, again, I'm teasing, aren't I? But, right, we're all going to go on a march, and I want rainbow-coloured placards, and I want them by 9 o'clock next morning. Might not be a way of including everybody from a family background. That's probably as good as I can come up with at the moment.